My son, Leo, left behind a $40 million fortune and a warning, Dad, if anything happens to me, be careful of Eleanor. I thought it was paranoia from his illness. But as I stood over the engine of my sabotaged car, his final words became a chilling prophecy. I was seconds away from fulfilling. This is the story of how I uncovered a web of lies to get justice for my son. If you believe that truth must always prevail, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. The silence in my son Leo's room had a texture. It wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from memories and missed opportunities. 3 months. It had been 3 months since the sterile, chemical smell of the hospital had finally faded from these walls, replaced by the faint, clean scent of his laundry detergent, still clinging to a jacket slung over his reading chair. I stood in the center of the room, letting the quiet press in on me. The afternoon sun, weak as it was, cut a dusty stripe across the hardwood floor, illuminating a universe of particles dancing in the stillness. My fingers found their way to the heavy glass trophy on his desk, one of a dozen that lined his shelves. Innovator of the Year, Global Cyber Alliance. It felt cool and unforgivingly solid beneath my touch. A permanent testament to a life that was anything but. I remembered the day he'd brought it home. His face flushed with a kind of incandescent pride he rarely allowed himself to show. He was never one for theatrics. He'd spent hours trying to explain the algorithm he'd designed, talking about zero-day exploits and protecting critical infrastructure. My mind, accustomed to the tangible world of stress loads and tolerances in steel and concrete, could only grasp the edges of his digital universe. But I understood the fire in his eyes. I understood his passion. Eleanor had been there. Of course. She'd drifted into the room, her attention snagged by her phone. Leo had held up the award. Look what came in. We won the Pone 2 prize this year. She'd looked up, her eyes taking a moment to focus. A polite, perfectly sculpted smile touched her lips. Oh, is that another one of your computer things? That's great. Sweetie, she'd said, her gaze already returning to the screen in her hand. Does it match the silver ones on the mantel? I was thinking we could rearrange them to make space for that new vase I bought from the gallery. Just like that. His crowning achievement, a breakthrough that would protect millions of people, was reduced to a piece of home decor, an accessory. He'd deflated, just slightly. A subtle dimming of the light in his eyes that I suspect only a father would notice. He'd laughed it off, but the moment had stuck with me. A tiny, sharp splinter in my memory. A chime from the grandfather clock in the hall jolted me back to the present. Almost on 1:00. Time to perform the final duty. The reading of the will. It sounded so archaic, so dramatic. But Arthur Vance, our family lawyer for decades, was a man who believed in tradition. The drive to his office in downtown Chicago would take the better part of an hour, and I needed to be clear-headed. I straightened the collar of my shirt, adjusted my tie until it felt like a knot of resolve in my throat, and gave the quiet room one last, long look. It felt like saying goodbye all over again. The garage was my sanctuary, a place where problems could be diagnosed, understood, and fixed. The familiar, comforting scent of motor oil, aging wood, and worn leather filled my senses. My sedan, a reliable car that had served me well for years, sat waiting. It was a machine I understood. I slid into the driver's seat, the worn leather groaning softly. The routine was automatic seatbelt, mirrors, Key in the ignition. My hand hovered over the key. A strange reluctance holding me in place. Sterling, don't start the car. The shout was a blade of sound that cut through the garage's quiet hum. It was raw, ragged, and laced with a terror so profound it made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I froze. Every muscle tensed, my heart launching itself against my ribs in a frantic, painful rhythm. Through the windshield, I saw my neighbor, Mr. Henderson, stumbling across his perfectly manicured lawn. He was wearing plaid pajama pants and a single slipper. His face, the color of ash. George was a man whose life ran on schedules and predictability. To see him in such a state of undress and utter panic was like watching the sun rise in the west. He reached the edge of my driveway and bent over, his hands on his knees, his breath coming in ragged, painful gulps. "George, what in God's name is wrong?" I said, stepping out of the car, the garage floor cold beneath my dress shoes. He looked up, his eyes wide and unfocused with fear. "Last night," he wheezed, pointing a trembling finger toward my car. "It was late, close to midnight. I couldn't sleep. My hip was acting up. I saw a car pull up. No headlights. It was her car. Sterling. Eleanor's. She got out, and she had the hood up. She was under there for 15, maybe 20 minutes. My brain struggled to process the information, trying to force it into a logical shape. Maybe it wouldn't start. Maybe she needed to check something. "No," he said, shaking his head violently. "No." She was moving quietly, like a thief. She had a little pen light, and she was focused. It wasn't someone trying to fix a problem. It was someone trying to create one. Then my cat knocked something over in the kitchen. The light flickered. She saw me in the window. Sterling. The look on her face, it wasn't surprise. It was pure, distilled guilt. She slammed the hood down so hard it echoed, and she was gone in seconds. The world tilted on its axis. The solid, dependable laws of physics and reason seemed to warp and bend. Eleanor, my daughter-in-law, the grieving widow who had wept so convincingly at the funeral, it was impossible. It had to be a mistake. And yet, another memory, one I had deliberately buried, clawed its way to the surface. The last text message Leo sent me from his hospital bed, just 2 days before the end. His fingers had been weak, the words slightly misspelled. "Dad, if anything haps, be careful of Eleanor. Trust me." I had read it and felt a pang of pity. The medication was strong. The illness was cruel. It was making him paranoid, making him see shadows in the corners of a life that was already too dark. I had replied with something gentle, something reassuring. I had told him to rest. Now, those words weren't a symptom of paranoia. They were a warning, a chilling prophecy sent from the edge of the grave. The engineer in me took control, a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos. I needed evidence. I needed data. "Thank you, George," I managed to say, my voice a dry rasp. "Go back inside. I'll handle this." He gave me one last, worried look before retreating to the safety of his home. I popped the hood. The engine was a familiar landscape, a city of steel and plastic I knew well. I scanned every surface, every connection, every hose. Nothing. Everything looked pristine, exactly as it should. A wave of doubt washed over me. Could George have been mistaken? Was I letting my grief get the better of me? No. The fear in his eyes was real. The warning from my son was real. The sabotage was just subtle. My hand was shaking, not with fear, but with a cold, rising anger as I pulled out my phone. I found the number for Ben Carter. He'd been my mechanic for 2 decades, a man with an intuitive feel for machines. The phone rang twice before he picked up. Carter's auto. This is Ben. Ben. It's Sterling. Hey. Sterling everything. All right, you sound a little off. I don't know, I said, forcing the words out. I need you to come over. Now. There's something wrong with my car. But it's not a normal breakdown. I think someone's tampered with it. Just please. Hurry. And bring your best tools. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. I'm on my way, he said, his voice stripped of its usual cheer. Now all business. Ben arrived in his work truck in less than 15 minutes. I recounted George's story, this time with more detail, my voice flat and emotionless. He listened intently, his brow furrowed, his gaze sweeping over the car as if it were a crime scene, which, I was beginning to realize, it was. He didn't waste time with questions. He got to work with a quiet, focused efficiency that I found strangely calming. The whir of the hydraulic jack, the sharp click of a socket wrench, the grating scrape of the creeper on the concrete floor, they were the sounds of truth being uncovered. He was under the car for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only 5 minutes. When he finally rolled back out, he didn't immediately get up. He just lay there, his flashlight beam fixed on something deep within the car's underbelly. His face, illuminated in the stark white light, was grim. Sterling, you need to see this. I knelt on the cold, oil-stained concrete. He guided my eyes with the beam of the flashlight. And then I saw it. The braided steel of the main brake line, and across it, a cut. It was thin as a razor, clean and hideously precise. See this? Ben said, his voice low and tight with anger. This braided steel is designed to withstand thousands of pounds of hydraulic pressure. It doesn't just snap. This took a high-carbon steel blade, probably a pair of cable cutters, and a steady, deliberate hand. It's cut about 90% through. It's designed to fail under pressure. The first time you had to slam on the brakes on the highway, the whole system would have blown out. You'd have nothing. The smell of brake fluid suddenly seemed thick enough to choke on. The highway. The entrance ramp was less than 2 miles from my house. There's more, he said, his voice growing even colder. He shifted the light to the steering assembly. He reached up and wiggled a heavy piece of steel. Atirot. It moved. These castle nuts are supposed to be torqued to 100 foot-pounds and locked with a cotter pin. The pins are gone, and the nuts are barely finger-tight. He let that sink in. At 70 miles an hour, the vibration would have shaken them loose in minutes. You'd go to change lanes, and the steering wheel would just spin in your hands. You'd be a passenger in your own coffin. I pushed myself to my feet, my body feeling ancient and brittle. I leaned against the workbench. The solid wood, a small anchor in a world that had come unmoored. The sequence of events was terrifyingly clear. A catastrophic brake failure followed by a complete loss of steering control on a busy Chicago highway. It was the perfect murder, designed to be mistaken for a tragic, unavoidable accident. The grief that had been my constant companion for 3 months transformed. It didn't disappear, but it crystallized, hardening from a dull ache into a diamond-sharp point of rage and resolve. The fog of sorrow was gone, burned away by the cold, clear light of this new, horrifying truth. I picked up my phone. My hand was perfectly steady now. I didn't call 911. An investigation would start. Questions would be asked. And Eleanor would be alerted. She would lawyer up, craft a story, and weep her crocodile tears. No, the justice system would get its turn. But first, she would face me. She would face the ghost she'd failed to create. I dialed the number for the local taxi service. As I gave the dispatcher the address of the downtown law firm, my eyes were fixed on the sedan in my garage. It was no longer just a car. It was a monument to her greed and her cruelty. She had planned my funeral. She expected me to arrive in a coffin. I decided to show up in a taxi instead. The taxi door closed with a solid, definitive thud, sealing me inside a capsule of worn vinyl and the faint, cloying scent of a pine tree, air freshener. As the car pulled away from the curb, I watched my house, my life recede in the rearview mirror until it was just another anonymous shape on a quiet, suburban street. For a moment, it felt like I was watching a scene from someone else's life. The man whose wife had planted those rose bushes, the man who had taught his son to ride a bike on that very driveway. He couldn't possibly be the same man now heading into the heart of the city to confront his son's murderer. The driver, a man with a kind, weary face, had a talk radio show playing softly. The host was laughing about something trivial, and the sound was so jarringly normal, it felt like a transmission from another planet. I turned my head and stared out the window. But I didn't see the familiar landscape of home. Instead, my mind became a projector, flashing a series of disjointed images against the inside of my skull. A highlight reel of Eleanor's masterful deception. I saw her at the funeral, a perfect portrait of the grieving widow, clutching a black lace handkerchief, her shoulders shaking with what I now understood to be meticulously rehearsed sobs. She had leaned on me, her touch light and frail, and whispered, "I don't know how I'll go on without him." Sterling. I, a fool drowning in my own sea of grief, had patted her hand and offered words of comfort. I had comforted my son's killer. The memory was a physical nausea that rose in my throat, hot and acidic. I saw her in the kitchen during Leo's final weeks, humming softly as she prepared his meals, special meals, she'd called them, full of nutrients to build up his strength. She was always the one to administer his medication, her expression a mask of tender concentration. The doctor said, "This is the best," she would say, brushing away my offers to help. "Let me take care of my husband." She hadn't been his caregiver, she had been his executioner, measuring out his death in careful, patient dose. How many times had I sat at that same table, thanking her for her devotion while she was slowly, methodically poisoning my boy. The taxi merged onto the highway, the same highway that was meant to be my deathbed. The rhythmic thump-thump of the wheels over the expansion joints in the concrete was a metronome counting down the seconds to the confrontation. With every mile that passed, the grief that had been a dull, crushing weight on my soul began to change. It was no longer a passive sorrow. It was being forged into something else. Something harder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous rage. But beneath the rage was a chasm of guilt so deep I felt I could fall into it forever. I am an engineer. My entire life, my entire career, has been built on seeing patterns, on identifying stress points before they become catastrophic failures. I could look at a blueprint and see the flaw. I could listen to an engine and hear the one-off key bearing that signaled disaster. Yet, I had lived alongside this monster, and had seen nothing. The signs had all been there. Small. Hairline fractures in the facade of her perfect devotion. And I had ignored every single one. I remembered a conversation a few months before Leo passed. He'd been losing weight at an alarming rate. "Dad," he'd said to me on the phone, his voice weak but clear. "I'm not sure, doctor. Evans is the right fit. I feel worse after my treatments. Eleanor insists he's the best." But he'd trailed off, not wanting to cause trouble. I'd told him Eleanor had done the research, that we should trust her judgment. "Don't waste your energy worrying. Son, just focus on getting better." I had effectively told him to ignore his own instincts. I had told him to trust his killer. And the nurses? There was one, a kind woman named Maria, who had been with us for a week. I remembered seeing her arguing quietly with Eleanor in the hallway. I couldn't hear the words, but Maria's face was tight with concern, while Eleanor's was a mask of cold dismissal. The next day, Maria was gone. Eleanor had simply said, her methods were a bit old-fashioned. I found someone much better. I had accepted the explanation without question. I was so lost in the fog of anticipatory grief that I couldn't see the serpent coiled right at my feet. The taxi sped on, the endless rows of suburban houses giving way to the taller, colder shapes of the city looming on the horizon. My knuckles were white where I gripped the armrest, the cheap leather creaking in protest. The guilt was afire, but the rage was the wind that fanned it. This was no longer just about Eleanor's greed. This was about my failure to protect my only child. And in that moment, sitting in the anonymous back seat of a yellow cab, I made a silent promise to the memory of my son. "I failed you once, Leo," I thought, my eyes fixed on the distant, glittering towers of Chicago. "I will not fail you again. I will not let her erase you. Your legacy will not be her blood money. I swear it." The intensity of the thought was so powerful it felt like a physical vow. My breathing, which had been shallow and tight, deepened. The frantic hammering in my chest slowed to a steady, powerful beat. The grief was still there, a permanent fixture in the architecture of my soul. But it was no longer the foundation. Resolve was. I knew what I had to do. The plan forming in my mind was simple, almost elegant in its audacity. It relied not on force, but on psychology, on Eleanor's own fatal flaw, her unshakable arrogance. She believed she had won. She believed I was a broken old man. A final, loose end to be tidied up. She would be walking into that office expecting a coronation. I would give her an abdication. I pulled out my phone, my fingers moving with a newfound steadiness. I found Arthur Vance's number. He picked up on the second ring. Arthur Vance. His voice was as crisp and starched as his shirts. "Arthur, it's Sterling. I'm on my way to your office now." "Sterling, I'm very sorry for your loss. I have everything prepared for 2 o'clock. "Arthur," I said, cutting him off, my voice low and urgent. "Listen to me very carefully. I have reason to believe that Eleanor was directly involved in Leo's death, and she attempted to kill me less than an hour ago." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a profound, dead silence. I could picture him in his corner office, high above the city, his hand frozen over a stack of legal documents. "Sterling, are you certain?" he finally asked, his voice stripped of its professional detachment. now laced with genuine shock. "I have incontrovertible proof regarding the attempt on my life," I said. "The rest is a logical certainty. Do not ask any more questions over the phone. But there is one thing I need you to do. Leo sent you a sealed, handwritten letter about a month before he died." "Correct, with instructions to only open it under specific circumstances." "Yes," Arthur said slowly. "Yes. I have it right here in the safe." "Good," I said. "Those circumstances have been met. I want you to be prepared to read it aloud during the meeting. Let the will be the setup. But that letter is the knockout punch." "Understood," he said, his voice now firm. The lawyer back in control. "I'll be ready. And Sterling, be careful." "It's a little late for that," I said, and ended the call. The plan was a risk, a huge one. She could scream, she could deny, she could create a scene that would paint me as a grieving, delusional father. But I was counting on the one thing that criminals like her always possess: an ego as massive as their greed. The shock of seeing me alive, followed by the public demolition of her inheritance, would, I prayed, be enough to crack her carefully constructed facade. My mind, now operating with a chilling clarity, dredged up more memories, more evidence for a trial that would first be held in that conference room. I remembered her selling off a few of Leo's rare, first-edition science fiction books, claiming they needed the money for an experimental treatment I had never heard of, and which never materialized. I remembered her complaining about the cost of a specialist Leo wanted to see in another state. "Is he really worth the money?" "Honey," I'd overheard her saying into the phone one night, thinking I was asleep, "the doctors here seem perfectly fine." She wasn't managing his care. She was liquidating his assets and cutting costs on his life. The taxi exited the highway and plunged into the concrete canyons of the city. The noise and the chaos of the traffic outside was a stark contrast to the cold, quiet stillness that had settled over me. The decision was made. The path was clear. I was no longer a man adrift in a sea of grief. I was a weapon, aimed and ready. I looked down at my hands, resting on my knees, on engineers' hands. They had spent a lifetime building things, creating structures designed to last. Now, they were going to be used to systematically tear something down: Eleanor's entire world of lies. The taxi pulled up in front of a skyscraper of glass and steel that speared the gray sky. This was her world, a world of power, money, and polished surfaces where ugly truths were hidden away. I paid the driver, my movements calm and deliberate. "Have a good one, pal," he said, oblivious. I walked into the marble lobby, my footsteps echoing in the cathedral-like space. The elevator ride up to the 45th floor was silent and swift. My reflection, a grim, determined stranger in the polished brass walls. My heart wasn't pounding anymore. It was beating with a slow, heavy, and purposeful rhythm. The elevator doors opened onto a hushed, carpeted reception area. The air smelled of expensive leather and money, and there she was. She was seated in a plush armchair, not dressed in the somber tones of mourning, but in a sharply tailored, expensive-looking black dress that screamed power, not grief. Her legs were crossed, and she was casually flipping through a glossy magazine. The picture of bored entitlement. She looked less like a grieving widow and more like a corporate raider about to close a very profitable deal. She was so confident, so utterly secure in her victory, that she didn't even notice me at first. She was expecting her prize to be delivered, neatly wrapped in legal documents. She had no idea that her judgment had just walked through the door. Then she looked up, a slight, impatient frown on her face, and her eyes met mine. For a full second, the universe seemed to hang, suspended. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, met mine, and I watched a tidal wave of emotions crash across her face. First, a flicker of annoyance at the interruption, quickly replaced by a cloud of confusion. Her brain, so quick and calculating, was struggling to reconcile the man standing before her with the man who should have been a mangled wreck on the shoulder of Interstate 90. Then, as the gears finally clicked into place, the confusion curdled into something raw and primal. It was the blood-draining, bone-deep horror of a predator realizing the trap it had set had failed, and that the prey was now staring back, very much alive. The glossy magazine, displaying a gaudy, diamond-encrusted watch on its cover, slipped from her limp fingers. It didn't make a loud noise, just a soft, defeated whump as it landed on the plush, ridiculously expensive carpet. But in the cathedral-like silence of that waiting room, it sounded like a gunshot. Her perfectly painted lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. The mask of the grieving widow, of the confident heiress, had not just slipped, it had shattered into 1,000 invisible pieces. And for the first time, I saw the true, grasping creature that had been hiding underneath all along. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, my dress shoes making no sound on the thick rug. I let the silence stretch, letting her marinate in her panic. "Hello, Eleanor," I said, my voice calm, level, and utterly devoid of the warmth it had once held for her. She flinched as if I'd struck her. Sterling. She finally managed to breathe. The name, a wisp of sound. What? What are you doing here, I thought. The traffic. She was scrambling, her mind racing for a plausible explanation, a foothold in a reality that was rapidly crumbling around her. The traffic was fine, I replied, stopping a few feet from her chair. I didn't sit. I stood over her, letting my very presence be an accusation. My car, however, ran into a bit of trouble. It's funny. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? A flash of pure, unadulterated fury crossed her face before being replaced by a mask of wounded indignation. What are you talking about, my God? Sterling. Have you been drinking? You look terrible. It was a classic deflection, an attempt to paint me as unstable, as an unreliable narrator in my own life. A few months ago, it might have even worked. But not today. I've never been clearer in my life, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing her to lean in. You'd be surprised what a near-death experience can do for one's perspective. Before she could craft another lie, the heavy oak door to the inner offices opened. Arthur Vance stood in the doorway, his face an unreadable granite slab. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed, who exuded an aura of calm, unshakable authority. He surveyed the scene, me standing, her frozen in the chair, the fallen magazine on the floor, and his eyes, for just a fraction of a second, met mine with a flicker of understanding. Sterling. Eleanor, he said, his voice a smooth, professional baritone that cut through the tension. We are ready. Please, come into the conference room. He held the door open. Eleanor rose, her movements stiff and jerky. like a marionette whose strings had suddenly gone slack. She refused to look at me, her eyes fixed on the door as if it were a portal to safety. She brushed past me, and for a moment, I caught her scent, an expensive perfume, floral and sweet, a scent I now associated with arsenic and severed brake lines. The conference room was exactly as I remembered it. From years of business dealings for my own small firm, it was a room designed to intimidate, with a long, gleaming mahogany table that felt a mile long, high-backed leather chairs, and a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. It was the kind of room where fortunes were made and lost. Eleanor walked to the head of the table, opposite where Arthur would sit, and claimed the seat as if it were a throne. It was her natural habitat. I took a seat halfway down the table, creating a deliberate distance between us. A no man's land for the coming battle. Arthur closed the door behind us, the soft click of the latch sounding like a vault being sealed. He sat, placing a thin, leather-bound folder on the table in front of him. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, so heavy I could feel it pressing on my skin. "As you know," Arthur began, his voice filling the cavernous silence, "we are here to execute the last will and testament of Leo Sterling. This document was prepared and signed in my presence and is legally binding." He opened the folder. I watched Eleanor. She was slowly regaining her composure, straightening her spine, arranging her hands on the table. A faint, confident smirk began to play at the corners of her mouth. She was telling herself that she had panicked for nothing, that I was bluffing, that whatever little drama I was trying to create, the legal document in front of Arthur was the only thing that mattered. The money was her shield, her fortress. Arthur began to read through the preliminary clauses, his voice a steady, dispassionate drone. A sum of $50,000 to be donated to the alumni fund of his alma mater, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. A collection of antique scientific instruments to be bequeathed to the Adler Planetarium. With each minor bequest, I saw the confidence in Eleanor's face grow. This was all going according to her plan. The old man was just having a grief-induced fantasy. She even shot a small, pitying glance in my direction. "Poor Sterling. He's completely lost his mind." Then, Arthur cleared his throat. He paused, his eyes lifting from the page to look directly at Eleanor. The room fell utterly silent. Even the distant city noise outside the great window seemed to fade away. "And now," he said, his voice taking on a new, solemn weight, "we come to the primary clause. Regarding the entirety of the estate's remainder, including all shares in the company Cyber Guardian Inc., all real estate holdings, and all liquid assets, with a current estimated value of $40 million U.S. dollars, my client, Leo Sterling, bequeaths it in its entirety." He paused for a single, excruciating beat, letting the two words hang in the air, a sword of Damocles over her head. "To my beloved father, Sterling." The sound Eleanor made was not human. It was a strangled, guttural noise, a mixture of a gasp and a choke. Her body jolted in the expensive leather chair, as if it had been struck by lightning. Her face, which had been a mask of smug assurance, collapsed. The color drained from it, leaving a splotchy, chalk-white canvas of pure, uncomprehending rage. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, that's not right. That's a mistake." She stood up so quickly, Her chair scraped violently against the floor. "This is a mistake," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "I am his wife, his wife. That money is mine. We had a deal, he promised me." Arthur raised a hand, his expression still a mask of calm authority. "There is no mistake. Eleanor, and as to why your husband made this decision?" He left a final piece of correspondence to clarify his intentions. He left a letter. He reached into the folder and produced a thick, cream-colored vellum envelope. My breath caught in my throat. On the front, in my son's familiar, slightly slanted handwriting, was Arthur's name. It was a ghost in the room. A final, irrefutable witness. He instructed me to read this only in the event that you contested the will, Arthur said, his gaze fixed on her, and you appear to be contesting it. He carefully slit the envelope open with a silver letter opener. The sound a soft, surgical shh. He unfolded the single sheet of paper within and began to read, his voice clear and steady, filling the room with the last words my son ever wrote to me. "To my father." Arthur read, and I had to close my eyes, the words hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "If you are hearing this, it means I am gone. And it means Eleanor is in this room with you, demanding what she believes is hers. I am writing this because I am afraid. For months, she has controlled everything, my food, my medicine, my doctors. I have grown weaker, sicker, in ways the cancer alone cannot explain. She has a coldness in her that I was too in love to see until it was too late." Eleanor stood frozen, her mouth agape, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror, the terror of exposure. Arthur continued, his voice unwavering. "The money changed her. Or maybe it just revealed who she always was. I know she will not take this well. Dad, I believe that Eleanor, in her own quiet way, helped me to my end. And I believe, with every fiber of my being, that if you stand between her and the fortune she craves, she will not hesitate to do the same to you. Please, be careful. This inheritance is not a gift, it is a warning. She is not a widow. She is a predator. Protect my legacy. And protect yourself." The letter ended. The final words hung in the air. An indictment from the grave. That was the final blow. The last thread of Eleanor's control snapped. "Lies," she screamed. The sound animalistic, echoing off the glass and mahogany. He was a weak, dying man. He was delusional. I took care of him. I sat by his bed day after day, smelling the sickness. The decay I earned that money, I earned it. She lunged across the corner of the table, her hands clawing for the letter, for the will, for anything she could destroy. Her face was a grotesque mess of rage and tears, the expensive makeup running down her cheeks in black streaks. You old fool," she shrieked at me. "You were always whispering in his ear, turning him against me. This is your fault." But Arthur had been prepared. He pressed a discreet button on the underside of the table. Before Eleanor could even touch a single piece of paper, the conference room door burst open, and two large, uniformed security guards entered the room. They were calm and professional, a stark contrast to her complete hysterical, unraveling. They moved to flank her. "Ma'am, you need to calm down," one of them said, his voice firm, but even. She spun on them, her rage now directionless. "Get your hands off me. Do you know who I am?" I stood up, my own chair sliding back silently. I looked past her. directly at the guards. My voice, when it came, was cold as the grave she had tried to put me in. "This woman is Eleanor Sterling," I said, "and she is not just contesting a will. This morning, she sabotaged my car. She cut my brake lines and loosened my steering. She tried to murder me." The room fell silent once more. The only sound, Eleanor's ragged, desperate breathing. The guards exchanged a look, their professional demeanor sharpening into something more serious. They each took one of her arms. Her fight seemed to drain out of her all at once, replaced by a dawning, hopeless dread. They began to lead her out of the room. Her protests now just whimpers. "No, you can't. It's a lie. He's lying." As they pulled her through the doorway, her head turned, and her eyes locked with mine one last time. They held no remorse, no regret, only a bottomless, venomous hatred. Then she was gone. The door clicked shut, and the silence that rushed back in was absolute. Arthur Vance slowly, deliberately, folded Leo's letter and slid it back into its envelope. He looked at me, his professional mask finally falling away to reveal a deep, weary sadness. He simply nodded. I walked to the great window and looked out over the city. It all seemed so distant, so insignificant. My hand came up to my face, and I was surprised to feel the wetness on my cheek. The first battle was over. The truth was finally out. I looked down at the letter Arthur had placed on the table. My son's final act of love. His final warning. The war, I knew, had just begun. The click of the conference room door latch settling into place was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a chapter ending, a cage being locked, a storm passing as suddenly as it had arrived. The silence Eleanor left behind was a physical presence, a vacuum that sucked all the air out of the room. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I remained at the window, my back to the room, watching a silent, indifferent city go about its business. Arthur Vance sat at the head of the table, his hands resting on top of the closed folder containing my son's last will and his final, damning words. Finally, he broke the silence. "I'll call Detective Miller with the Chicago PD," he said, his voice weary but firm. "I've known him for years. He's a good man. He'll handle this correctly." I turned from the window. The single tear had dried on my cheek, leaving a faint, tight feeling on my skin. "Thank you, Arthur," I said, "for everything, for believing me." He gave a slow, sad shake of his head. "I didn't just believe you, Sterling. I believed your son. I've been holding on to that letter for a month, and it has felt heavier every single day. I'm just sorry it came to this." The days and weeks that followed were a blur of legal procedure and grim discovery, a slow, methodical process of dismantling Eleanor's web of lies. It began with my statement, given in a small, featureless room at the police precinct. I recounted the events of the morning, my voice steady, my engineer's mind laying out the facts in a logical, linear sequence. I provided them with Ben Carter's name, and his detailed, photographic evidence of the sabotage was treated like a sacred text. Mr. Henderson, my neighbor, gave his statement, his fear replaced with a quiet, civic fury. His security camera, a small, unassuming dome under the eaves of his roof, proved to be the nail in the coffin of her alibi. The footage was grainy, shot in the ghostly black and white of infrared. But it was undeniably her. It captured her car pulling up without its lights, her slender form moving with a furtive haste to my garage, the hood of my car lifting, and then, 15 minutes later, her slamming it shut and fleeing into the night. The detective dug deeper, and the picture that emerged was uglier than I could have imagined. They subpoenaed her financial records, and it turned out she wasn't just greedy, she was desperate. She had over $200,000 in secret credit card debt and personal loans, a life of luxury and excess, lived entirely on borrowed money, and my son's good name. She hadn't just been planning for a comfortable future. She had been trying to outrun a financial avalanche of her own making. Then came the hardest part. The lead prosecutor, a sharp, empathetic woman named Miss Davies, sat across from me in Arthur's office. She explained that while the case for attempted murder was ironclad, the suspicion of Leo's murder was still just that, a suspicion backed by a letter, to make it a reality. To get true justice for my son, they needed more. They needed to exhume his body. The word hung in the air, grotesque and invasive. The thought of disturbing his final resting place, of violating that sacred ground, was a physical agony. I had buried my son once. The idea of unburying him felt like a desecration, a betrayal. I pictured the cold earth, the machinery, the disruption of his peace. My first instinct was to scream, no, to tell them to leave him be. But then I looked at the copy of Leo's letter on the table. Protect my legacy. His legacy wasn't just his money or his company. It was the truth. Eleanor had not only stolen his future, she was trying to steal the truth of his past. Letting her get away with it would be the greater desecration. With a heavy heart and a voice that felt like it was full of gravel, I gave my consent. The wait for the toxicology report was the longest 2 weeks of my life. When the call finally came from Miss Davies, her voice was quiet but resolute. They had found it. Significant. Long-term levels of arsenic. A poison that mimics the slow, wasting effects of a prolonged illness. She had been killing him slowly, patiently, right under my nose. Her daily deliveries of nutritious meals and essential medicines. Nothing more than instruments of a cold, calculated murder. The trial took place 6 months later. I attended every single day, sitting in the front row, a silent, unmoving witness. I watched Eleanor walk in, her tailored dresses replaced with a drab prison jumpsuit, the confident swagger gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed weariness. She had a high-priced lawyer who tried to paint her as a loving wife pushed to a moment of madness, and me as a manipulative, grieving father trying to steal his son's inheritance. But you cannot argue with a severed brake line. You cannot argue with security footage. And you cannot, it turns out, argue with the chemical signature of murder left in the body of its victim. The moment the jury foreman stood up, the courtroom was so quiet I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I didn't look at Eleanor. I looked at the foreman's face as he unfolded the piece of paper. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, he said, his voice clear and strong, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Eleanor Sterling, guilty." He paused. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant, Eleanor Sterling, guilty. A wave of something, not joy, not triumph, but a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and relief washed over me. There was no outburst from Eleanor this time. No screams or accusations. Just a quiet, shuddering collapse into her chair. The final, Pathetic deflation of a life built on greed. The judge sentenced her to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Justice, in its slow, grinding way, had finally been served. A week after the sentencing, I drove out to the cemetery. It was a crisp, clear autumn afternoon. The sky, a brilliant, cloudless blue. The leaves on the maple trees were a riot of red and gold, and the air was clean and cool. I stood before Leo's grave, the stone simple and dignified. Just as he would have wanted, I had brought a single, perfect white rose, and I laid it gently on the grass. For a long time, I just stood there, the silence broken only by the rustle of the wind in the trees. The storm inside me had finally passed. The rage was gone. The need for vengeance satisfied. All that was left was the vast, quiet landscape of my grief. But it felt different now. It was no longer tainted by questions and anger. It was clean. It's done. Son. I whispered to the quiet stone. I got her. She won't hurt anyone ever again. I read your letter. I understood. I'm so sorry. Leo. I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner. The apology I had been holding in for months finally came out, and with it, the tears. Not the hot tears of rage or the desperate tears of shock, but the slow, quiet tears of a father who missed his boy. I had kept my promise. His legacy was safe. But then came the question of what that legacy truly was. The money, the $40 million that had been the catalyst for so much pain and death, sat in an account, feeling less like a fortune and more like a radioactive artifact. I couldn't touch it. It felt unclean, soaked in blood and betrayal. I met with Arthur in his office a few weeks later. I don't want it. Arthur, I told him. Any of it. Using it for myself would feel like I was letting her win. He nodded, as if he had been expecting this. The money wasn't the point. Sterling. It was the weapon she chose. But a weapon can be reforged. He slid a prospectus across the mahogany table. You could start a foundation, a charitable trust in Leo's name. You could turn the instrument of her greed into an engine for good. And just like that, I found my purpose. The next few months were a flurry of activity. We established the Leo Sterling Foundation for Oncological Research. The mission was simple: to fund the most innovative and promising cancer research, to support the brilliant minds, the other Leos of the world who were fighting to ensure that no other family would have to endure what we had. The entirety of the $40 million estate became its seed money. It was the ultimate act of alchemy, turning the ugliest parts of our story into a promise of hope for others. A year passed. The sharp edges of my grief began to soften. I found a new routine. A new reason to get up in the morning. I wasn't just a retired engineer anymore. I was the steward of my son's true legacy. Today, I visited one of the first labs the foundation had funded. It was a bright, bustling place, filled with the hum of complex machinery and the quiet, focused energy of young scientists. A brilliant young researcher, a woman whose passion for her work reminded me so much of Leo, was showing me a 3D model of a protein they had successfully isolated. We think this could be the key to turning off the replication mechanism in certain types of tumors, she explained, her eyes shining with excitement. It's still early, but it's a huge step forward. The grant from your foundation made this possible. Your son's work is saving lives. Mr. Sterling. I looked from her hopeful face to the complex image on the screen. A beautiful, intricate structure that held the promise of a future my son would never see. A future he was now helping to build, And for the first time in a very long time, I smiled. A real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. Greed had taken my son's life, but it could not touch his legacy. A legacy isn't something you leave behind in a bank account. It's the good you put out into the world, the lives you touch, the hope you create. Eleanor had tried to steal a fortune, but in the end, all she had done was ensure that Leo's name and the goodness it stood for would live on forever. And it was my honor, my final duty as his father, to see that it did.